Thank you very much to all of you for being here relatively early, even by General Assembly standards. Welcome to this breakfast dialogue on health technology and innovation and access in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This breakfast dialogue is timely as it comes only a week after the release of the final report of the high-level panel on access and 2 days after the United Nations' first ever high-level meeting on antimicrobial resistance. For those who don't know me, my name is Magdy Martínez-Solimán. I'm the Assistant Secretary General for Policy in the United Nations Development Programme. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this breakfast. A little over a year ago, UN member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development that committed to leaving no one behind, as the phrase has been coined. The 2030 Agenda is undoubtedly ambitious and complex, and there is much to do, including, of course, on health. The report of the Secretary General's high-level panel addresses a number of issues which are critical to health and the 2030 Agenda more broadly. Health takes a central place in achieving sustainable development, human development. One of the key commitments under Goal 3, ensuring healthy lives for all, is achieving universal health coverage and providing access to safe, effective, quality and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. All countries, from the poorest to the most prosperous, are facing challenges with regards to the costs of many medicines, diagnostics and vaccines. Second and third line treatments for HIV are often out of reach of patients. The high-level panel report documents how 11 out of 12 cancer medicines introduced into the US market cost over $100,000 per patient per year or more. Medicines for rare diseases can cost several $100,000 per patient per year, placing an egregious burden on patients and health systems. There are also some diseases for which the market-based model has not delivered health technologies at all. The looming crisis of antimicrobial resistance is one prime example. Others include multi-drug resistance, TB and malaria, as well as neglected tropical diseases. We have to do more to incentivize innovation for unmet health needs, and we are actually doing more. The objective of this breakfast dialogue is to discuss the role of health technology, innovation and access in advancing the goals. We're delighted to have such a high caliber panel of speakers, including Professor Stiglitz and 4 members of the Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines. Speakers will, I hope, be referring to some of the key recommendations of the panel in making their remarks. So let's begin. Our first speaker is precisely Professor Joe Stiglitz, an American economist, known by all, professor at Columbia University, co-chair of high-level expert group on the measurement of economic performance and social progress at the OECD, and the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. He is the recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences 2001 and the John Bates Clark Medal. Professor Stiglitz, you have the floor.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me say, commend this report. I think it's really very impressive and addresses some issues that have been beneath the surface, which I've seen for, I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, and I've seen these issues percolate beneath the surface for a quarter century, and it's finally brought them out into the open and says something ought to do about them. In particular, the pressure of some developed countries, including my own, trying to make sure that developing countries and emerging markets don't avail themselves of the flexibility that is built into TRIPS. So basically, the United States has been trying to effectively renege on the international rule of law. You sign an agreement, but then you say, we're going to try to undermine that agreement. And this document brings that out in the open. It may not go far enough in addressing the problem, in the sense that I think one can make a compelling case for automatic licenses, some way of of changing the burden of proof of what you need to do to get a license to make it more difficult for the advanced countries to use their in many cases it is not subtle, but subtle pressure for countries not to take advantage. So in the recommendations here, they don't go that far, but what they do is explicitly talk about pressure, which is a very real, I've seen it over and over again around the world. So this is just one example of many things that is finally brought out in the open. So I just want to commend you for doing that. Let me begin by talking about the broader issue and then how this report, I think, deals with that in the right way. There's always been a balance, a need on the one hand for innovation, on the other hand for the distribution of the benefits. And that's always been viewed as a trade-off between a little bit big pharma and generics. In the United States, we had a debate about that, the Hatch-Waxman Act. It's difficult to know whether you've gotten the perfect balance. It's part of the political process. I think they were too much for big pharma. What disturbs me is that many of our trade agreements are doing an end run around that kind of public discussion of the balance. And they're trying to really use trade agreements to get an agreement that is more favorable to big pharma than they could if they had an open discussion within each of our countries. And so, and I'll come back to that later on, but I think this is the fundamental issue. The political use of these trade agreements to upset which should be a very delicate balance. I was, to tell you the truth, a little bit astonished by the letter of the U.S. State Department, which clearly hadn't read the report, where they said there was not enough attention to innovation. The whole thrust of the report is about innovation. So to me, it was very clear that it must have been written by a lobbyist. And I understand they're understaffed and they don't have time to do their own writing of letters. But it was a little bit of embarrassment from our government that they should have had such a one-sided reaction. This nature of this balance between big pharma and generics is going to change over time. It's going to be different between different countries. And in recent years, there's been new understandings about the nature of that balance. When I say that, new work in empirical and theoretical economics. And there have been a number of institutional innovations, and I won't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll give some examples if I can. Let me emphasize the importance of this issue, because in a lot of other issues in economics, there are not lives at stake. But when we are talking about access to life-saving medicines, we are talking about lives. And so the trade-off is very different. It's not the monopoly profits of the drug companies, of the big pharma, versus the profits of the generics, where you can understand there's always going to be a battle between one corporate interest and another. This is where the outcome of this battle is going to determine who lives and who dies. And I think one has to always keep that in mind, that this is not the usual kind of just economic trade-off. And that's why these issues ought to be very highly politically charged. But the fact that there is money involved has implications, more implications in this sector than in almost any other, because in this sector, government is always going to be greatly involved in a budgetary way. That is to say, even in a rich country like the United States, through Medicare and Medicaid, we, the public, bear a very significant fraction of the cost of the drugs. And so when the prices go sky high, when there are monopoly pricing rather than competitive pricing, the cost is borne by the average taxpayer. So this is really a trade-off between the monopoly drug companies on the one hand and ordinary citizens on the other. It's actually even worse than that, because we realize that most of the basic research that the drug companies are relying on is done, financed by the government and by universities through endowments. So the drug companies are living off knowledge that is being publicly produced and then capturing it for themselves and making us pay twice. We pay for the research and then we pay for the product. And they get these huge monopoly profits. And it's a distortion in the choice of drugs and in the direction of research. And one of the big things that they point out, and something I've been concerned about for a very long time, is that when you have this kind of system, it directs innovation not ways that, and not in general, not in ways that maximize public health. It maximizes profits. And there is a very big difference between societal well-being in these areas, where there are huge externalities, and societal and profits. So profits are not a good guide to where we ought to be doing research. So you have to begin with realizing this is not like producing a better tablecloth, where we can have the market mechanism. This is fundamentally different. So national budgets are at stake, huge amounts, and all the countries, developing and developed countries, are facing now huge budget constraints. And so the trade-offs of what are being given up when you give more monopoly profits to big pharma, we all sacrifice either in higher taxes or cutting off other essential needs in developing countries, the basic process of development. So the final part of this report, contrary to what the US government said, is about innovation. And the question is, what is the impact of alternative arrangements? And this report talks about, in a variety of ways, that the current arrangement actually impedes innovation. There's been a long discussion about the role of various patent intellectual property regimes, data exclusivity, on innovation. And I'll come back and talk about it a little bit more later, but there's a growing consensus among economists that the current arrangements harm innovation. And this report makes a set of recommendations that will actually promote innovation. So it thought about the issue in a thoughtful way, and was moving in the right direction. Normally we can't do experiments in economics and in social sciences, very hard. But in this particular case, we actually had an experiment. The experiment was the US Supreme Court ruled that Myriad, a company which operates from Utah, one of the senators been very active in trying to counter these kinds of advances. The US Supreme Court said you cannot patent genes. And this particular case was one, again, in which hundreds, if not thousands, of people were dying because of the patent system. Because Myriad had a patent on the two BRCA genes. Their test was inferior to that which Yale developed. They refused to let Yale use their test because they said, we own the gene and you can't use your test. They wanted to get the data. Because of the inferior test, woman did die, and in some of the testimony before the Supreme Court, vivid stories of that. And the Supreme Court ruled that these patents are not valid. And in the aftermath of the elimination of those patents, innovation has increased, there are better tests, and prices have come down 90%. You could not have had a better test of the adverse effect of the current patent system. In my mind, I've done a lot of, I'm basically an economist and work in asymmetric information. when I come to at the gates of St. Peter, which won't be that long, and you knock at the door and you say, why should I come in? I somehow feel that the lives I've saved there, I participate. I worked with the ACLU in bringing that case. That was probably one of the most important things I've ever done. So these are, it goes back to what we're talking about, the lives that are being saved. So let me then turn to the issue of trade agreements. There is, I think, a broad consensus among economists that these intellectual property provisions should not be included in trade agreements because the spirit of them is restricting the movement of goods, the movement of ideas across borders. Trade agreements are about facilitating the movement of goods and ideas across borders. And my colleague at Columbia, Jagdish Bhagwani, with whom I disagree on many things, one of the things that we agree on is these should not be in trade agreements. He said they counter the objective of trade agreements. Well, it was included for the first time in the Uruguay round, the TRIPS agreement. And one could see the adverse effects on budgets. Shortly after, in 2003, about a little less than a decade after TRIPS was enacted, I participated as a member of a global commission on the human dimensions of globalization that the ILO and others had helped put together. It was a commission made of government, NGOs, private sector, so we wanted to have a balance. We had everybody there. And we all agreed on one thing. We needed to move to what we call TRIPS minus. And that is to say that TRIPS had not provided enough flexibilities, had not provided enough access to medicines, made it too difficult to get licenses, compulsory licenses. And we needed to redress that balance. Unfortunately, since then, the United States and some other countries have been pushing for, and somewhat successfully, for TRIPS Plus. And this is one of the first documents forcefully from the international community again saying, let's go to TRIPS minus. Let's re-examine the mistakes we made. Now, let me just make one comment. I was in the Council of Economic Advisors when TRIPS was being discussed. I was the member of the council that was responsible for intellectual property, and they did consult us on this. And our conclusion was TRIPS was bad for American science, TRIPS was bad for global science, TRIPS was bad for developing countries. And that was not just our view, that was also the view of Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this was the view from the scientific community. So you have to understand, this is not about innovation. This is not about the advance of science. This is about the profits of the drug companies, and it happens to be also the entertainment industry. There are special interests. But this is not about innovation. The patent system, TRIPS, is not about innovation. And they consulted us and we said, this is wrong. And they went ahead and took the provisions from the pharmaceutical industry. Well, even in those days, we were concerned with the provision of 301, Section 301. We had which tried to punish countries that we thought were not protecting intellectual property by withholding other benefits like preferential tariff benefits. And unfortunately, that trend has gotten worse in a context where it became less needed. And the bill the facilitation bill that many of you may know about, the Super 301, makes this worse. But let me make clear why I think this kind of provision is so bad. It undermines the international rule of law. We have an international rule of law defining what ought to be the rules for TRIPS, for intellectual property. I thought it shouldn't be there. I thought it was too strong. It was not balanced, but we have a law. And now the US is trying to say, oh yes, we have a law, but we're not going to obey it. We're going to write our own law. And if you don't, this is really important because the UN is about creating an international set of norms and an international rule of law. And the United States always talks about the rule of law. And yet, in one way, when you try to unilaterally decide what the rules of the game are, that's not the rule of law. That's breaking the international rule of law. What countries need are the flexibilities of compulsory licenses that are included in TRIPS, but they have to be able to be put there without somebody waving a bat over you and threatening you with one consequence or another. And the history of the kinds of linkages of things they will do if you issue compulsory licenses that I've heard over the last 20 years, there really is a litany of things that are really ugly. And the US is big enough that some governments just cave in. Most governments do. They're not going to stand up to the United States. And even if it would have been difficult to do this, I mean, like a threat to a country like Colombia and say, we're not going to help you in your drug enforcement now, it's not in the interest of the United States that, the reason we're helping them is that we're concerned about those other issues. And the linkage of the profits of the monopolists to these other interests that are vital to the United States and the world, I think is unconscionable. And the fact that there are some senators, some congressmen that are trying to make that linkage, I think ought to be brought out more in the open. And that's why creating some kind of register so that people can see what is going on. It is simply because of the secrecy and the non-transparency that some of this goes on. If it were brought out in the open, I think it would not have happened. The final point I want to make is, and I made this point when I was talking to the negotiators for the TPP, science is fast, it changes very rapidly. It's very hard to write down rules today that are appropriate. They're going to be appropriate in 25 years. So take an issue that's become symbolic of a lot. I'm not quite sure why it became symbolic, was the number of years of data exclusivity for biologics. But that's become a symbolic issue. What is the right number? Well, my view might differ from other people, but what is very clear is whatever that right number, it is hard to conceive that that number will be the same in 25 years. Biologics didn't exist 25 years ago. So how could you start having a discussion about that? And what that says is these trade agreements need to be live agreements. What do I mean by live agreements? They have to have, these provisions can't be locked down for the next 25, 50 years. It's very hard to change the agreements once you make them. What they need to do is have a process of constant review by the scientific community, not by the big pharma, not by the producers, but by the scientific community of what are the right provisions. I've talked to a lot of producers of biologics who argue that it should be 0 years, that this is a dynamic area and keeping data exclusivity is actually impeding innovation any years. But whatever the number, what you see here is the nature of the special interest, because what was interesting, for me, the President of the US was arguing for a lower number than the USTR. Now, USTR, you might say, is supposed to be working for President Obama. They were roommates, but sometimes he seems to be working for the drug companies. The issue, why was President Obama concerned? One of the reasons he was concerned is he was trying to get the cost of health care down. That was one of the signature achievements is Obamacare. But another one was, he's concerned about the budgetary implication. An 8-year or a 12-year or, the longer the monopoly power, just simple as that, the longer the monopoly power, the higher the price. Why did the drug companies want these? Why do some of the drug companies, the less innovative drug companies want it? The really innovative ones are going to come up with something new every year. The less innovative ones that want it, they want more monopoly profits. It's not, This is not rocket science. But more monopoly profits mean we, the taxpayers, are paying more, and our budget deficit gets larger, or something else that we really, really need gets cut out. It's just that simple. So the President Obama's thought he balanced it right, but his balance was very different from the USTR, very different from one of the senators who was trying to increase the length of life. Well, let me just conclude. A big theme around the world today is globalization is not working. Both of the candidates in the United States for president, all the candidates, Brexit, discussion in Europe, globalization is not working. And when we think about globalization not working, there are some areas of globalization where there are complexities, trade-offs. We get more, we get less. And you have to debate that. There are some areas where there's no justification. The secret havens, Panama, British Virgin Islands, Channel Islands, all of these things. That's a lose-lose. The only people who gain are the scum, where people are trying to hide their money. So that's something where we ought to get rid of. That's an aspect of globalization that we get rid of. But this attempt to give more, the attempts to give more monopoly power through trade agreements to Big Pharma is another area where I think it's a lose-lose situation with only one group winning, the monopoly powers of the Big Pharma, and all the rest of society, including the pace of innovation. And that was what was so good about the report. It had a balance between access and innovation and showed that the ability, what kind of innovation really counts? The cost of actually, and of drugs delivered, and the quality of the drugs delivered, access to the drugs. So let me just end by commending the report and hoping that the recommendations, the very detailed and very thoughtful recommendations, be quickly implemented.
Thank you very much, sir. I think it would be an understatement to say that you've got our discussion going. This house is very well known for two things: for being a home to guarded and very diplomatic language, but also being a home to freedom of expression and quite passionate speeches. So I think we got the second brand of it. Thanks very much for your contribution and poignant critique. Our next speaker is Professor Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, development economist, my mentor. She's published widely on a broad range of development policy-related issues. She's Professor of International Affairs at the New School here in New York. She was our director and lead author of a decade of UNDP human development reports, very, very important human development reports between 1995 and 2004. And she served as a member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicine. Professor Fukuda-Parr, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here this morning, even though it was rather a struggle to get here so early. I want to just make a few points. I think after Joe's presentation, we all feel there's not much more to say. First of all, the panel, I think, was very well aware of the need for a sustainable solution. And I personally have not really been on the front lines of these debates and the negotiations, but let's recognize that over the last 20 years or so, there has actually been enormous progress in finding the innovative arrangements to expand access to life-saving medicines and to increase R&D for neglected diseases through such mechanisms as tiered pricing and all kinds of partnerships, creative solutions like patent pools and so forth. And I think the important example of this progress is the expanded access to HIV retrovirals to millions and the reduction in price from what was more than $10,000 per patient for a year's course of treatment in the early 2000s to what is now today $100. So this is actually a story of remarkable success, and I don't think we should forget about that. But it was actually a result of incredible mobilization of civil society, negotiations between national governments, pharmaceutical manufacturers, donor agencies, foundations, and so forth. But they did finally find common ground. But the problem with these solutions that we have been finding for the last 20 years is that they are case by case, arrangements made disease by disease, product by product, country by country. And therefore, what we need is a more sustainable solution that can only be found through a more institutionalized mechanism to respond to situations where existing mechanisms and existing system of incentives do not work and leave these multiple gaps in the possibility for people to access the medicines that they need and other health technologies, and the innovation that you need to meet the urgent health priorities of today, yesterday, and also of tomorrow. And so, our report gives numerous examples of these gaps that are not only long-standing but are emerging. The long-standing problems have to do, for example, with the neglected tropical diseases of people who have very low incomes. But now, today, we have many other gaps in access for people who have much higher incomes in not just developing, but in developed countries as well, medicines for cancer, hepatitis C, and so forth. And so these problems are not going away, and I think that what we therefore need is a new approach and to finding solutions, a more systemic one. And that leads me, of course, to the core of our recommendations that have to do with advancing new models that create new incentives for innovation. And the current system, which fundamentally relies on high prices to fund research and development, is going to leave these gaps because the market incentives for private investment essentially is not going to places where there are not much potential for making profit. And this is perfectly understandable. And this is the reason why we need alternative approaches to create incentives for innovation that de-link the system of incentives from the high prices. And I think this is already something that is well recognized. The political declaration on AMR that was adopted by the GA this week has actually included groundbreaking language on the innovation failure and that lack new antibiotics represent. And governments are committing to ensure public return on public investment on R&D, and pharmaceutical companies are asking to recognize the importance that the costs of investments in R&D is de-linked from the prices and volume of sales to facilitate equitable access to medicines, diagnostics, vaccines, and other health technologies. And apart from government investments, of course, there are many other mechanisms that have not been utilized. For example, the new sources, innovative sources of financing, new sources of like airline taxes that have been used in a very limited scale. There is a limit to how much taxpayers will be willing to pay additional sort of like income taxes, and this is the reason why alternative global sources of financing need to be tested, explored. Thirdly, I want to make comments about the human rights. And I was in fact asked to specifically focus on this relationship between human rights and trade and investment treaties. I think that the whole point about this is that governments have obligations for both human rights and for managing the economy, expanding the economy, making sure that the economy works in such a way to create jobs and so forth. And trade and investment is an important part of that strategy. Governments, but their commitments and their obligations for human rights are often neglected. They're not really known about. People don't talk about them very much, particularly because there are very weak enforcement mechanisms in the way that that contrast with the enforcement mechanism for trade treaties. Governments under international human rights treaties have the obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights, including the human right to health, to access health care, including medicines, as actually the Committee on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights recently commented. And the wording of the treaties actually very explicitly state that the governments must take appropriate legislative, administrative, and other measures. And of course, that means making sure that you have a health system in which citizens can acquire affordable medicines to meet their needs. Now, these commitments that countries have to pursue public health priorities through public health policies often are not compatible with the commitments that they make under, for example, the TRIPS agreement. And that is the reason why we have had, in fact, another wonderful achievement in the 2001 Doha Declaration that clarified the nature of the TRIPS flexibilities. Of course, we have to debate whether those were adequate and so forth. But I think that the point I want to make is that for a long time we have actually recognized that you do need to put in place these measures that make it possible where national governments exercise their sovereign authority and responsibility to fulfill the rights to health, the highest standard of health for its citizens. So finally, I want to just end by emphasizing that this is an urgent global priority. That this is not just something that can be solved at the level of a national government, but that these impending health emergencies like AMR and what we are seeing with Ebola and Zika and so forth require a global solution. And this has to be something that is universal. This is a universal issue. This is not just an issue for developing countries, for the least developed countries. It is an issue for all of us around the world, including, as Joe has so graphically explained, the US for the cancer patients, those in need of hepatitis C treatment, the children who need EpiPen, and all of that. And so I want to emphasize that global action is needed. For example, the report contains a number of actionable, implementable recommendations that I think that the international community, including, of course, not just governments and international agencies, but also the other stakeholders, need to engage in. For example, starting to negotiate a code of conduct, for example, for code of principles, perhaps not conduct, but code of principles for biomedical R&Ds trying to get some consensus on what the priorities are and things of that kind, and working towards a binding a convention at a later date. We were very mindful of the need, of the opportunity that was presented in the creation of our panel in proposing both immediately implementable actions as well as longer-term objectives that would not be achieved immediately, but which you needed to start working on to achieve over a longer period. Something like a binding convention is not something that will be implemented today. Something that can be implemented today, for example, is to take much stronger action against retaliatory measures for implementation of the TRIPS flexibilities. But I hope that my hope is that this community that is here assembled would take many of the recommendations forward in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that commentary that unpacks, I think, the dynamics between duty bearers and right holders in this issue. Our third panelist is Dr. Yusuf Hamid. He's a scientist and non-executive chairman of Cipla, a pharmaceutical company that produces generics under the mantle Caring for Life. Dr. Hamid has led major efforts to treat HIV and AIDS neglected diseases in the developing world and to give patients life-saving medicines regardless of their ability to pay, talking about science and private business that saves lives. In 2001, Cipla offered the world's first affordable AIDS cocktail for an unprecedented cost of below $1 per day. He served as a member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicine. Dr. Hamid, you have the floor.
Thank you. Respected speakers, ladies and gentlemen, access to medicines and access to health care at affordable prices has been the mantra of the third world and the developing world for the past 50 years. Now, towards this, what India did in 1972 abolished product patents and only retained process patents. And this ultimately led to India becoming today the pharmacy capital of the world. Just to tell some of the Americans who are here, 30% of all the drugs that you consume in America originate in India. That's something worthwhile, what happened way back 50 years ago. Now, developing countries like Italy, Spain, Portugal, in the early 1980s, brought back product patents. And you can see for yourself how it stifled their progress in healthcare. Of the 7 billion people on our planet today, 6.2 billion live in the emerging world. The current pricing and patent monopoly regime ensures that only about 10% of the world's population are eligible for decent health care. While the emerging nations are developing today, there is an urgent need to provide essential drugs to safeguard a stable and healthy environment, particularly in the emerging world. Now, 20 years ago, the stranglehold of monopoly led to millions of Africans dying of AIDS, and as the prices of the antiretroviral drugs were beyond the reach of the poor countries. We, in 2001, brought in a drug cocktail called Triamune at a price below $1 a day. At that time, the prices prevailing of a cocktail of drugs was between $12,000 to $15,000 per patient per year. This magical figure of $1 a day, what did it achieve? It changed the whole course of pricing and monopoly and access to medicines for the future. However, it's very important to realize that at that time, when my company Cipla initiated this, we did not break any laws. We abided by the laws of the land in India, we abided by the patent laws of India, and we abided by the international patent laws. However, in Africa, the situation was different, and it was therefore left to doctors and activist groups to lobby with their governments to allow them to ultimately purchase antiretroviral drugs from India. And today, it's interesting to know that although 2,000 people back in 2001 could afford treatment in Africa, today over 15 million Africans are being treated in Africa alone. And this initiative that we started 15 years ago has helped produce anti-AIDS drugs. Today, India produces 90% by volume of all the anti-AIDS drugs produced worldwide. And we believe that this humanitarian approach has been responsible for saving at least 10 million lives over the past few years. Now, what is interesting to note, and I mentioned this a few months ago here at the UN, was that all the newer patented ARV drugs are today accessible by voluntary licensing. Companies like Gilead, FIV, BMS have given the latest antiretroviral drugs to Cipla and other Indian companies on a voluntary basis. And I have therefore assured Africa that we will provide them for the next decade or more all the latest antiretroviral drugs at affordable and reasonable prices. This is something, Madam, we give you our assurance we will do for Africa.
Thank you.
And the interesting thing is that not only are these drugs going to be produced in Africa, but we now have factories in South Africa and in Uganda, and these drugs can be produced in Africa as well. I'm a great believer personally of self-reliance and self-sufficiency in countries. And this is something I think the African countries should individually decide upon. We have offered, my company and I have personally offered, totally free to African governments, technologies and medicines that they would like for their countries, and provide them with factories and things. Now, this present voluntary AIDS response should be extended to other universal healthcare access. Access requires political will and the participation of both public and private pharma cooperation. This is absolutely essential. What we did in AIDS, people don't know. We have extended that affordability factor to TB, malaria, and cancer. And today, many Indian companies, because there is no monopoly and there's free competition, we are able to reduce prices and make products available at accessible prices. Now, regretfully, in the current scenario, WTO, with the support and backing of the developed world, has enforced TRIPS Plus they're trying to enforce, and patents, and India unfortunately capitulated in 2005. We are now therefore at the crossroads of what to do. Our Indian patent law must protect not only India, but also be a model for the developing world who depend on us for their medicines and for their technology. Personally, as a scientist, I've never opposed patents. I've only opposed monopoly. We believe that innovation should be suitably rewarded. Professor Stiglitz mentioned public-funded research, innovation. The American government today, for conceptual R&D in pharma alone, spends over $31 billion a year. Now, if this is public-funded money and for research, I think in all due respect, this research therefore should be non-exclusive and should be for the public, and therefore mankind should benefit. Now, in passing, it is important to realize that even the USA disregarded patents in the field of nuclear research. And during the recent national emergency of anthrax and bird flu, the Americans were well prepared to bring in compulsory licensing. I know I was approached personally by the American government, would I supply them ciprofloxacin, and would I supply them oseltamivir for bird flu, even though these products were covered under patents here. In the year 1969 to 1992, Canada, under their Bill S-91, had a pragmatic licensing system that enabled them to manufacture whatever drugs they wanted to and pay a predefined royalty to the innovator. A recent example of the benefits of voluntary licensing is that of Gilead licensing Cipla and other Indian companies their new hepatitis C drug called sofosbuvir. Now, this life-saving drug retails in America at $84,000 per course of treatment for 84 tablets. And our products in India, which are bioequivalent to the originator, is available in India and some of the other markets, developing markets, at below $300 for a course of treatment. Now, this is the same I can tell you on HIV. The drug that I give Our Lady in South Africa at below $100 a year. Equivalent product called Odimune, which is the similar bioequivalent to AAA here in America. You all are paying here $24,000 per patient per year, which we are supplying to South Africa at $100 per patient per year. The divide in healthcare between the developing and the emerging world is immense. The UN report has clearly and strongly addressed this issue and has recommended that countries prepare their own legislation on licensing. What I propose, therefore, is a pragmatic voluntary license with a suitable royalty. In the absence of this, let countries decide what patented essential drugs they require and ask the innovator for an obligatory license. If this obligatory license is denied, then perhaps the country on a national basis could evoke compulsory licensing. So this, I'm suggesting 3 stages: voluntary licensing, obligatory licensing, failing which, as a last resort, compulsory licensing. And I think that in our UN report, this has been clearly mentioned, that this is something that I think the world requires. Now, apart, when we talk about access to medicines, I think this should include that poor countries are dependent on international donors. They don't have the money even for the essential drugs that they require. Apart from the drugs, we have to be very careful regarding regulatory approvals and harmonization of regulatory matters. And quality is a big issue as well. The role of newer diagnostics and vaccines, which are coming up, is of utmost importance. Earlier this week, we discussed antimicrobial resistance at the UN. What we generic companies can do is important to understand. We are well advanced in pharma R&D. We spearhead incremental innovation of existing drugs, enhancing their efficacy by using enhancers and boosters, newer delivery systems and devices, combining existing antibiotics similar to the cocktails that we have today for HIV, AIDS, for AIDS, HIV, TB, and malaria. If newer antibiotics are developed using public funding, then these should be made available on a non-exclusive basis for the benefit of mankind. Medical science is shifting more from chemistry to biology. The cost of this transition is fantastic and enormous. And to give you just two examples are the latest anti-cancer drugs mentioned earlier, Keytruda of Merck and Opdivo of BMS, which are totally beyond the reach even of an average individual, irrespective of his geographical location. Today, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we stand at the edge of a precipice of a healthcare and humanitarian calamity. Our collective action at this time, in the form of acceptance of the UN report, will go a long way to determine the fate of future generations for decades to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamid, for joining, I think, Professor Fukuda-Parr in this sense of urgency and emergency that both you developed in your statements. Our next panelist is Madam Malibona Matsoso, the Director General of the National Department of Health from the Republic of South Africa. Madam Matsoso has held leadership positions at national and international levels on public health policy, ethics, and research, and she served as a member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on access. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning. I've been asked to talk about how to address unmet needs, but I thought I needed to go back to 2000 and establish as to what the world looked like, in 2000. In 2000, the MDGs were adopted. In 2000, the cost of ARVs were more than 10,000 per person per annum. In South Africa in particular, HIV/AIDS was devastating. It was claiming lives, leaving little or no hope of survival. We also in South Africa at the time had the court case, but we've seen with the solidarity and joint action how indeed affordable treatment was possible. But I thought I needed to give a little bit of background as to how this actually happened. Even before CIPLA made an announcement, MSF conducted a study in Khayelitsha in Cape Town. Some of you may not even know what Khayelitsha is. At the time, I was the head of medicine regulation in South Africa, and they asked whether they could do a comparative study for the existing drugs at the time and cheaper and less expensive generics. There wasn't a mechanism in our law to allow for such a study, but we found ways in which they could conduct the study, and at the time they released the report that showed indeed that this could be affordable. And we were quite pleased that at the time, as that happened, we also saw financial flows through Global Fund, PEPFAR, and the CHAI, and I say Clinton Foundation because they went around the world also negotiating prices. More recently, we've also seen Unit 8. So I thought I needed to mention that because the reduction in prices also had to go hand in hand with financial flows, which have been quite useful in helping us. I can say, in particular in South Africa, we benefited immensely because we were able to put more people on treatment. But competition works, and I think we've seen the power of competition. Competition that drove prices down, but also competition should also be meshed with newer formulations. And I'm glad that at the time we saw the development of fixed dose combinations. They would not have happened if it wasn't for innovative regulatory pathways that were introduced at the time. I mean, the first being pre-qualification. I know at the time when pre-qualification was announced, there was quite a lot of pushback, but we've seen the benefits of pre-qualification a decade later, how it has benefited many. Equally, something that is never spoken about is the tentative approval by FDA, which was introduced in the US. And it was useful because what the FDA did at the time, they enhanced They came up with an enhanced mechanism of approving medicines that were still under patent, but that were not for use in the US, but they could be used for developing countries. And we explored that mechanism because we thought it helped even the development of the guideline for fixed dose combinations. Today we have fixed dose combinations because we worked collaboratively. We can pride ourselves today that we have 3.4 million people on treatment in South Africa, precisely because they are on fixed dose combinations and precisely because it is affordable. But we still have unfinished business because for second and line and third line treatment, it is still not affordable. The cost of treatment of MDR and XDR TB is still a concern. But of course, the growing burden of NCDs, in particular the cost of treatment, especially of cancer, is of concern. But because we're a country with colliding epidemics because of the burden of HIV and TB, as well as the growing problem, the emerging problem of NCDs, that puts a huge burden on the health system. But I'm hopeful because there is renewed hope because we've got the sustainable development goals which usher an opportunity for a collective response, because it introduces the principle of universality that requires of us to address unmet health needs so that we leave no one behind. This report actually should be viewed in that light. But of course, the recent developments show that there is still a need for new approaches and for an accelerated response. From 2015 to 2030 is 15 years. Let's not wake up 10 years later to respond. Let's start now because we have an opportunity. There's quite a lot of momentum built. Let's avoid the mistakes of the Ebola outbreak, because that it should serve as a lesson for us, because there was a vaccine in development and the work stopped. Let's not have that again in future. Again, Zika is a problem, is an outbreak, everybody is talking about it. But nobody is talking about the future disabilities and rehabilitation that those countries with constrained resources will have to deal with. There's no reason why in this world today we have shortages of yellow fever. It just doesn't make sense. Yellow fever has been in existence for a while, we've been using it, but there are shortages. We just need an outbreak in a developed country. Perhaps there'll be an accelerated drug development. But there are also abundant medicines, production shortages. BCG was in shortage, furosemide, atropine, benzyl penicillin, at the heart of discussions of antimicrobial resistance. The world runs out of benzyl penicillin. It just doesn't make sense. So the emerging problem of antimicrobial resistance cannot just be a discussion about R&D only. It should be a discussion about preservation of some of the products that we have, so that we continue to ensure that they're available and accessible. But what has been quite interesting is the debates that I watched on TV during this UN session. Discussions about EpiPen in the US. It just demonstrates the lack of transparency in pricing. Daraprim is another one with price hikes. So it makes logic why there's been recommendations for delinkage and why it should be a consideration by all of you. There are still gaps, innovation gaps. Innovation gaps because pediatric formulations, for instance, show that children are not young adults. They need formulations that are age appropriate. They may be complex to develop, but they cannot be ignored nor neglected. development of regimens that are shorter and less toxic. TB treatment, for instance, is a case in point, in that for MDR-TB, we need faster and quicker development. We have 2 drugs, one suitable for pediatrics and one for adults, but I think we need more because MDR and XDR-TB are killers. The concept of push, pull, and pulling should be further explored, particularly for TB drug development, where pushing is about upfront grants, pulling for financial rewards, and pull as patent pools. So we have a momentum at the moment for antimicrobial resistance. Let us use this as an opportunity to test some of these ideas, particularly delinkage. It can be one opportunity we have to respond. If we do pull these together, of course it needs some governance structure, some mechanism of some sort, and the global mechanism that will help us prioritize and ensure that we can promote needs-driven research. So the coordination of R&D and its financing, working on sound incentives that ensure sustainability long-term, is this opportunity. So there's nothing wrong in starting discussions now on global R&D treaty. This report presents an opportunity, and we see that as an opportunity that will ensure that no one is left behind. Let's avoid the mistakes that we saw with the HIV and AIDS, because a lot of people were left behind then. So let this never ever happen again. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. I think you made eminent sense enumerating a number of situations that don't make sense. Our last and final panelist is Ms. Winnie Byanyima, Executive Director of Oxfam International. Ms. Byanyima was a Member of Parliament for 11 years. She served on the African Union Commission as Director for Gender and Development and at UNDP as the Director of Gender Equality. She recently co-chaired the World Economic Forum in Davos and is a member of the high-level panel on access. Ms. Byanyima, you have the floor.
Thanks, Magdy. The high-level panels, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The high-level panel's report pays attention to the issues of accountability and transparency, and that's what I'm going to talk about. As you know, most decisions around medicines are shrouded in secrecy. Let me present to you the 4 key aspects of secrecy that this report discusses, which together increase policy incoherence. And then I have a 5th area that I want to add. First, the cost of R&D. How can a national authority decide if a price is fair if it doesn't know the real cost of making the medicine? It remains the case that pharma companies want us to believe the figure they tell us without questioning. When Oxfam started campaigning on access to medicines in 2001, we were told by the industry that it costs $500 million to bring a medicine to the market. Recently, the same study group, a group that is funded by pharma, which told us that it is now $2.7 billion. Yet other studies, as the report rightly mentions, estimate the cost to be much, much cheaper. So figures on medicine development in reality account for spend and on other aspects such as marketing. And we also do not know government's funding in various forms, like grants or tax breaks, and Joe Stiglitz spoke to that. Therefore, the report recommends that all the cost details should be made available to the authorities in order to assess prices. Second area, prices. Prices vary across countries with little rationale except being set at the maximum a market can bear. If countries do not know prices in other jurisdictions, they cannot decide appropriate prices for themselves. So the report recommends expanding the existing WHO price database to all medicines in all countries. For this to happen, we need both governments and companies to provide WHO with accurate price information, and we also want that the World Health Organization then gets on with the work. The third area, patent information. It's very difficult to get information on who holds what patent in which country on any medicine. This secrecy has a chilling effect on generic manufacturers for fear of infringing on a patent if they were to produce a generic version. Similarly, studies have shown that patents can also deter further research for the same reason. This report boldly recommends transparency on patents information. This means that companies and other patent holders must make patent information public. In theory, WIPO should hold a public database of all patents on health technologies in all countries. The fourth area, clinical trials. Studies have shown that trials that have positive results have much more chances of being published than those that show natural effect or even side effects. Medical guidelines and prescriptions depend on test results. Therefore, the report recommends that all trials, irrespective of results, must be publicly available. The WHO has a website, but pharma companies have not populated it yet. They should get on with that. But there's a fifth key aspect of secrecy that Oxfam wants to bring to this debate on transparency, and that's in trade agreements. And again, Professor Stiglitz has spoken very well on that. Normally, trade agreements include measures that tie governments' hands from adopting pro-health policies. Yet these agreements are negotiated in secret. Take TPP, that involves the United States and 11 other countries. The public, the media, civil society, and even parliamentarians get to see agreements like these only after they've been finalized. And we have to rely on leaked drafts to find what's in them and what's not in them. This is not acceptable. The report recommends an impact assessment of the potential effects of trade and investment measures on access to medicines. I and two fellow panelists, Jorge and Shiba, we presented a commentary recommending a ban on inclusion of intellectual property in trade agreements. We already have the WTO TRIPS agreement. Why should we have more restrictions? So we have a report that we can work with, but how do we now ensure that the report's recommendations are implemented and monitored? This brings me to accountability and putting in place the mechanisms to ensure accountability by various actors. This should exist in governments' domestic policies, at the international level, and of course for the private sector. Let me take each one by one. On government commitments, first, I strongly agree with the recommendation that commits governments to assess the situation of access to medicines in light of human rights. Civil society must be encouraged and supported to make shadow reports. Shadow reports work. I'm from the women's movement. We've used them to negotiate and to take to implementation the Beijing Platform for Action. But getting this right means ensuring civil society has the resources to do this effectively. And secondly, governments must ensure coherence on national policies between all relevant departments. Civil society needs a seat at the table to be able to advocate on behalf of people and monitor government on policy coherence to enhance access to medicines. And then the private sector too must play its role. Yes, in terms of transparency and responsible ways of doing its work that I've mentioned now. But business too must stop doing what we see time and time again, putting pressure on governments to prevent governments from adopting pro-health policies. Yes, we can monitor policies and practices of governments, of companies, of international bodies, if we have enough resources. But what if they don't perform? We can monitor. And then if we find they're not doing the right thing, then what? This report recommends some accountability measures for behaving badly. For example, we recommend that any pressure is considered a violation of the TRIPS agreement itself, and that the WTO enacts strong punitive measures against governments that are exerting pressure on other countries trying to implement pro-health policies. Finally, at the international level, we urge the Secretary General to act swiftly on creating an independent body that is tasked with monitoring and measuring progress towards access to medicines. Again, civil society should be part of such a monitoring system. And the wider UN, measuring progress on human rights and access to health technologies, assessing behavior of all actors, should be the subject of the recommended UN session on medicines in 2018. So the UN, the Secretary General, all the agencies of the UN, and countries should put in place appropriate mechanisms and start implementing the recommendations of this report right away. We trust in the Secretary General's enduring commitment to leave no one behind. This report is vital for achieving this objective. I thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Winnie, for your statement. You have realized by now that I've done a lousy job in keeping time, but I'm going to ask our panelists and all of you to stay on for a few minutes just to hear a few reactions from the ground, 3, 4, maybe we will have time for that. I'll start at the back. Please just identify yourself and let us know who you are. You have the floor, ma'am.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm Lori Phipps from the U.S. Mission to the UN, and thank you very much for putting on this panel. I think, as you very rightly noted, this is an example of freedom of expression. We're always happy to have civil society. It makes for a very interesting discussion. I'm glad that someone has mentioned the U.S. statement. I'd like to bring everyone's attention to that statement by the United States government on the report of this panel. It's available on the State Department's website, and I have a few copies of it here if anyone is interested. Just a few highlights from that U.S. government reaction. The United States is committed to working with partners to improve access to medicines, and I think you need to look no further than our funding for the Global Fund, the PEPFAR funding, the President's Malaria Initiative, to know that we put our money where our mouth is. We are trying to improve access to medicines, and that's an effort that we want to continue pursuing. We, however, are very disappointed with the report of this panel and with the mandate that this panel was given, which regrettably we think was quite narrow and missed an opportunity to look at some of the more complex reasons for the inability of all to access medicines. There are some 300 plus essential medicines that are on the official list of essential medicines. Only 20 or so of them are actually under patent. So we're missing an opportunity to look at why those other 280 aren't available to people when there's no intellectual property barriers to accessing those. Intellectual property rights and trade are essential to medical innovation. We share the concerns that were raised by some of the panelists who are not here today, but those panelists who have been pragmatically involved in research and development and bringing medical innovations to the market. We share their concerns about some of the conclusions and recommendations of this panel, which we think would be divisive and actually impede innovation and impede access to medicines rather than furthering that shared cause. We note that the panel has concluded its work and that there is not a consensus on the recommendations, neither amongst member states nor even seemingly amongst the panelists themselves, because if you read the commentary, you will see there were some concerns raised about the conclusions. So I know we're very short on time. I draw everyone's attention to the US statement that's posted online, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. There's so much was said about US and US policies.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your contribution. Yes, sir?
Thank you very much. My name is Adriano. I'm from the South Center in Geneva, is a think tank supporting developing countries. My Director General was not able to be here, so he just asked to send his message of support for his report. He believes that it's a clear public health perspective and from human rights perspective as well, and its analysis and recommendations are in support of access for affordable medicines, especially in developing countries. So therefore, we are here to bring support, and we hope we can also help in the implementation of this report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At your table, Representative of Switzerland.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I also would like to be brief, as the meeting should already be over, but thank you so much for the presentation and also sharing your reflections. Building also on what the United States has been saying, just one question to the panelists which are present today at this event. What are the next steps? I mean, what is going on? There are a number of recommendations in this report. We were hearing that some of them could be implemented immediately. We were also hearing that it is necessary to come up with a comprehensive response. We see certain challenges in that regard, but we also see definitely the necessity, in order to come up with a comprehensive response, to enter in a dialogue with member states, but beyond that, with stakeholders that have to be part of the solution and cannot just be the problem, as we heard. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your question. Last intervention here at the center table. Which madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. My name is Rosemary Mseginari. I represent units to the African Union and the ECA, which is the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. We work a lot with the African Union, and they too have what they call the Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Plan, which is their roadmap that will see Africa producing drugs locally, but also is working on regulation which is aimed at improving access to medicines. When I listen to the report, it touches a lot of issues, some of them that affect structurally the access to medicines through the policies, through many other aspects. My question is, how does the panel intend to bring this very rich discussion to the country levels and the regional levels? Because countries really need to come face to face with some of the issues that are discussed here that affect the international trade agreements that they are signatory to, the science that they are trying to develop capacities in their countries, the activism that the civil societies are involved in. So how does this report really come to the regional level so that these very important issues discussed can be discussed with others. I have a suggestion. African Union and the ECA usually hold a Ministers of Finance and Planning meeting every March. So Ministers of Finance, who are the pivots of all the other policymakers and decisions, usually attend those meetings. How can they be privy to this kind of discussion and look at such issues? So UNAIDS, we work very closely with the UNDP, NIDO, WHO, and African Union, as I mentioned. How can we work with the panel to bring this conversation to the Ministers of Finance? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I saw another couple of hands, but please, 30 seconds. We don't have time for more. Yes, Miss here.
Hi, Judith Rios from Doctors Without Borders. As my international president, Dr. Joanne Liu, said this week at the UN high-level meeting on antibiotic resistance, MSF very much welcomes the report recommendations, and we thank you for bringing to the attention to the world the crisis of access to medicines and lack of innovation that our medical operations have suffered for years. We really think this report is a unique opportunity because finally the patient's needs, no matter where they live, are not going to be discriminated. The globality of your recommendations, the fact that you're looking at patients' needs no matter where they live, including here in the United States of America and in Europe, where I'm from, is very much welcome. The fact that you're looking at all diseases and our medical technologies is very much welcome. So thank you for your work. We're looking forward to implement these recommendations and do everything MSF can to support them. I also want to ask for a clarification on U.S. government position on this report. I do think there is a complete lack of policy coherence on what the Obama administration is currently proposing to U.S. Congress to do to respond to the rising crisis of high prices of medicines in the United States. Many of the recommendations of this report are in fact in the Obama's administration proposal to Congress right now, including increasing transparency on R&D costs and pricing. So I would like to understand what specific recommendations of the report the U.S. government supports and which ones they do not. Thank you.
I'm afraid we won't have time for that interaction, but I'm sure that at the end of the session, the representatives of the U.S. mission will be happy to clarify that for you. The last point is for you, sir, at the back of the room. 30 seconds.
Thank you. I'm from India. I represent the Permanent Mission of India here in the United Nations. My name is Mayank. I'm consular here looking after health issues and human rights issues. Thank you very much for the today's discussion. It has been very fruitful, and we see that there is a unanimous support for the panel report. My country also welcomes the report. We see that all the issues have already been pointed out. We fully support them. The only issue which we want to make, the only thing which we see is that there are some concerns regarding the panel report which are coming up, and we, from our side, would like to see that these issues need to be addressed urgently. So we want that the report should be discussed as soon as possible in all relevant UN forums, including the HRC, where I think the submission has already been made. Very important points here are to be discussed about the TRIPS flexibilities, the human rights issues regarding public health, and also access to medicine, which has been a long-standing issue, and we look forward to this discussion as soon as possible. So that is our submission, including the role of WHO, which needs to be strengthened in the access to medicine issue. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the fine Indian optimism around the unanimous support to the I think it's a very welcome contribution. I'm going to give in the reverse order literally 1 minute to each of the panelists. If they can be disciplined, they will help us to get to our next commitments. I'm sure all of us have something else to do this morning. Winnie?
Thanks. 3 points. One, our work is done. As a panel, we've handed our report to the Secretary General. The report belongs now to the United Nations. And I challenge the United Nations to take that report and bring it to the governments, to the regions. We as civil society will do our part. Oxfam doesn't want, we'll be disappointed by those who are throwing water on this report. Nothing has been won in the UN at once. Everything is step by step. We've made some progress here through this report. We were not happy with some parts of it, but we want to use it to go forward on rebalancing human rights and the profits of pharma. We are moving forward with the report. We will work with the UN to take the reports to people, to governments, to win on those parts that we can win on, and to continue pushing for more reform towards human rights, less towards the profits of business.
Thank you. Alibona?
Oh, thank you. I also would like to see the panel has finished its work. Of course, it doesn't have an expanded mandate, so the report has been presented to the Secretary General, and I'm hopeful that it will be discussed in different formations of the UN and different agencies. But I'd also like to really appeal. Like I say, I've watched in this country Congress debate the EpiPen problem. And it was bipartisan, which is what was, meaning they put their political issues aside and debated, because people with anaphylactic shock in this country need EpiPen, and it has become unaffordable. And I would imagine that the case for affordable medicines in developing countries, particularly those countries with colliding epidemics, is what would require that we respond in implementing some of the recommendations, because the recommendations are not just for the UN, some are for governments. And I would imagine governments can start taking leadership as well in responding and in implementing some of the recommendations.
Thank you very much. Yusuf?
Well, my target is the lady at the back who mentioned that the US was opposing the UN report. I'd like to bring to her attention two factors. One was the Doha Declaration. Doha Declaration was voted even by the Americans 149 to 0. Then came the ratification. In the ratification, the Americans wanted the word other epidemics removed from point 5C. TB, malaria, AIDS, and other epidemics. They didn't want the word other epidemics, but the rest of the world wanted. So they put it to the vote. The vote was 148 to 1. Guess who won the vote? The one vote. The American veto on the Doha Declaration. Coming to something closer home, you mentioned funding by the Americans. Let me tell you the story of PEPFAR. I think none of you know the story of PEPFAR, the true story. We gave a document to the President Bush. He gave that document to through Senator Hatch. He said, gave it to his speechwriter, said, put it in my union speech. And it said the following: because the price of the anti-AIDS drugs has fallen from $12,000 to $300, it gives the world an opportunity. And towards this opportunity, America will put $15 billion over 5 years under PEPFAR, President's Emergency Program for AIDS. What happened the next day? 7 CEOs of big pharma turn up at the White House and asked President Bush to revoke his statement. Why did you mention $300? And President read this thing and said, sorry, I will not revoke my statement. I'm telling you a true story. I will not revoke. Okay, then if you form PEPFAR, give us the permission to appoint the head of PEPFAR. So that is when Tobias Randall was made head of PEPFAR. What did he do? The first thing he did said, it is American money going into PEPFAR. Only products approved in America are eligible for this PEPFAR fund. And we went to them and said, look, we are WHO approved, the drugs are required for Africa, not for America. Sorry. It took us 4 years to get American approval for our antiretroviral drugs. In the meantime, PEPFAR issued tenders, only the large companies could quote, and because of that, not buying for Africa from WHO approved sources, at least 2, 3, 4 million people could have been treated more at that point in time. So it's all very well giving donations and grants and whatnot, but not with strings attached. And I think the UN report clearly shows that what the world requires, and particularly the third world and the developing world and the emerging world. And I think it should be taken pragmatically and with that in mind.
Thank you. Thank you. Sakiko?
Thank you very much. We have, just to the, reacting to the question about what's next, I mean, clearly this is a report, our report is to the Secretary General. It is up to the Secretary General to decide how to take it forward in a formal sense. But this is a public, he has agreed to release it. It is your report. What has gone into this report is a massive investment in public debates, a lot of research, the nearly 200 or so inputs that we received, contributions that we received, were from extremely well researched proposals, and I think this does represent an enormous stock of knowledge about that diagnoses the nature of the problem, and that offers creative solutions. And I think that this is should therefore be taken not only as a political opportunity, but also as a source of, as an opportunity that provides enormous opportunities for all kinds of actors. Much of the recommendations are putting the ball in the hands of national governments to take action, like doing empowering ministers of health to do human rights impact assessment of trade and investment treaties, something that is not always done when a country signs up for a trade and investment agreements that are basically led by the ministers of trade and industry. So I think that this should be seen really as an opportunity for all actors to take parts of the report that call for action and think about how they can be taken forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakiko. Joe, last words of wisdom?
Okay, well, I have the advantage of not having been on the committee, so I can give an unbiased view. I'm the only one here who does not have a particular interest or representing a lobbyist who has an interest. So I think I can give the only unbiased statement. I think it's a fantastic report. And so, you know, obviously it hasn't dealt with every problem. You know, in a few pages you can't deal with every problem, but it highlights that there are a lot of problems that can be solved, and that there is a lot of progress that can be made if we harness the thinking of a lot of people, and we step a little bit aside of the special interest and the lobbyists who dominated so much thinking in this area. Health is a global problem. Knowledge is a global good, public good. And that's why this ought to be discussed here at the UN. What health in one country can affect, go across, you know, go across borders. Diseases don't carry passports or get visas when they go across borders. So health is a global problem and has to be addressed at the WHO, but the global rules, we're talking about trade rules, we're talking about competition rules, need to be discussed here and broaden the agenda of the UN. Now, I think the issue of abusive pricing in those areas where there's not a patent is a really important issue and is being discussed. But it actually illustrates a deficiency in U.S. competition law compared to the competition laws in many other countries. We do not, in the United States, have a provision about abuse of market dominance. Many other countries have a provision about abuse of market dominance. And it seems to me that there's a very easy answer to some of these. All countries ought to have a provision, like has been done in several countries, of abuse of market dominance. And when charging those kinds of prices, that's abuse. That illustrates, I think, a theme that's resonated a number of times here. Competition actually works. And the irony here is the US government, who all the time is talking about the value of competition, is defending monopoly. Now, when I say that, you know, the American people are not on the side of monopoly. So there are many cases where the U.S. government does not speak for the American people. It speaks for the big powers, the lobbyists. And unfortunately, you know, I know when you're in the U.S. government, you can't, you know, one of the great things of having left the U.S. government is I can speak a little bit more freely than, and less diplomatically than I would have. But, you know, when people's lives are at stake, I'm not sure it's a good idea to beat around the bush. I think it's really better to, as I say, call a spade, and the fact that people are dying because of the abuse of monopoly power, and that monopoly power is related to our healthcare system. So finally, one of the things I want to commend your committee and commend this report is that it has opened up a broader democratic debate about the rules of the game. Yeah. And this is probably one of the most important things that we could have. I hope we have this debate in every country around the world, because many of these rules are domestic rules. But I also think we're talking about a global system that is not working, that is inconsistent with human rights in many dimensions. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, which we don't talk about as much as we should, and in which the United States played a very central role. Eleanor Roosevelt played a very central role in creating that. It's one of our proud things that we should be proud of. And today we should be doing everything that we can to sort of have coherence between these values, which I think most of us subscribe to, and what we are doing both at the UN and within our own countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As you can see, the debate immediately becomes vibrant. I'd also like to say it's a tough debate. And let me thank the panel for their contribution, the members of the high-level panel for their work, those who have spoken today, the South Center, the Economic Commission for Africa, Switzerland, Médecins Sans Frontières, the USA and India. I think it is fair to recognize the gracious and resilient participation of our colleagues from the US mission. Thank you very much for your gracious participation and for being here. And if I had to make one takeaway, the high-level panel report has a simple and powerful message. No one should suffer because he or she can't afford medicines, diagnostic, or vaccines. That wonderful human intellect, innovation, and creativity has illuminated. I think that's our takeaway. As Winnie has said, next steps of implementation are up to us, and we will have to push this debate forward so that we see who can do what in bringing about some of the solutions we've spoken about today. Thank you very much. Thank you for staying over time, and have a good day.